So I'm going to share a slide as we transition into our second speaker, who is a long-term colleague of mine, much younger, also fellow Dominicana. And Dr. Yasmiyn Irizarry will discuss her paper, Does STEM Stand Out? Examining Racial and Ethnic Gaps in Persistence Across Post-Secondary Fields. She is Associate Professor, recently tenured of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, with secondary appointments in Sociology, Mexican American, Latino Studies, and Population Research Center. Dr. Irizarry's research focuses on the quantitative study of racism, race and its intersections, especially as it relates to ethno-racial identification and measurement, and inequality in K through 16 schooling. She has pursued a lot of research with support from the NSF, the Gates Foundation, the RWJ, as a co-PI on a project that we're working on right now with Dr. Edward Vargas, who's at ASU. Also from the Ford Foundation and the American Educational Research Grants Association. Her work is published widely in Educational Researcher, Sociology of Race, Ethnicity, Social Problems, etc. And she earned her BA in Sociology from Ohio State, MA and PhD from Indiana University. And I think you all have a copy of her paper. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yasmiyn Irizarry.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Can everybody hear me? Just want to make sure. Okay, good. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm always excited when I get a chance to talk about these topics and talk about these topics with audiences who really care about complicating Latinidad and really serving students by understanding both, not just collectively how they experience education, but also how within the differences in how they experience educational spaces, contexts, and how they're served in those spaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to present, I have a presentation and it will end with the paper that you were given, but it's going to start much earlier than that because one of the things that I've tried to do with my research is rather than focusing on any one time point, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is really thinking about the accumulation of these things. So we get students when they're in college and we try to intervene in college and we forget all the accumulation of things that happen prior to arrival and how much those matter for the way we serve different populations of students when they arrive to universities, HSIs or otherwise. And so I'm going to talk a little bit of the work I've done in these different moments. But let me see if I can get this started. There we go. But I'm going to start with a little bit about what informs my work. So when I was working on my doctorate, there were several pieces that came out around the time that I was working on my master's and my doctorate work that were really trying to draw attention to the work in education and the racial misunderstandings in education, specifically through the absence of populations, through a lack of disaggregation, just the way that race is or isn't being attended to, how it's being attended to in education research, and the limitations that creates in terms of what we understand about students' experiences and how then we can better serve them. And so I want to talk just briefly about the theoretical frameworks that kind of undergird the work that I do. So my work is situated in intersectionality, and I specifically spent time really thinking about what we call intracategorical complexity. And I heard Dr. Alvero earlier talk about that. He said intracategorical, and I was like, yes, which is really trying to get at the complexity within these larger groups that we tend to think of as groups, right? So within pan-ethnicities, thinking about the complexities at these intersections, but rather than thinking just across groups, also within groups and the complexities within those groups at the intersection of racialization, but also of other markers of difference. I'm also very passionate about this idea of multidimensionality. I've actually written a piece on it, and specifically about the multidimensionality of race and racialization, understanding that race racial ascription, racialization is a process that is, while primarily informed by phenotypic markers, is also informed by other cultural cues and how those intersect to inform how people are racialized and the kinds of opportunities that they have or don't have as a result of that. And within my education work, I spend a lot of time thinking about schools and educational institutions and spaces as sites of opportunity hoarding. So a lot of my focus is on spaces that are hoarded spaces and looking at the experiences of students that are what we could think of as, let's say, higher achievers, or within spaces that are more hoarded, like within STEM pathways and things like that. I was frustrated with the fact that I believe that there should be a focus on all students, but that the focus on race was often on this kind of deficit narrative of Black and Brown students, and not attending to the hoarding that happens that keeps them from these spaces of opportunity. And lastly, by the work of Victor Ray, looking specifically at schools and educational organizations as racialized organizations. So looking at the way that, make sure I have all my notes are not showing on here, so I'm going to kind of wing it, but looking at the way these organizations serve as a meso-level space where there's a hoarding of resources, and where the racial order and racial positions are reinforced through both ideologies and stereotypes of students by the actors within those spaces. And so what I want to talk about are some work I've done at 3 different moments in students' educational trajectories that we know are strongly associated with where they end up in STEM and the likelihood of achieving STEM, because these important things that you'll find out when we get to the last paper are really an important part of that pathway in thinking about this, because the way that students experience inequality and discrimination is not at one singular moment, but rather is an accumulation of many moments. And so what I often do is focus on what I consider moments of disruption, where there can be an accumulation of experiences, but where these experiences at particular moments can be particularly disruptive to whether a student is able to continue on a particular pathway. So I'll start with a moment shortly before gifted identification. The gifted identification and gifted programs are often very strong predictors of whether a student will end up in advanced course taking later on. So you see STEM course taking, and thus then whether they'll end up in STEM degrees. So thinking about these pathways and some moments where there can be particular disruption and how that looks like at the intersection of different markers of difference, with a focus on Latinx students, but also attending to other students as well. So what I'm going to do is start with some of my work on teachers' perceptions, what I call teachers' perceptions at the starting gate, looking specifically at teachers' perceptions in first grade. So for those of you who do have children, you'll know that around first or second grade, students are often marked for gifted programs. Teachers are one of the primary sources of that identification. In most districts, it's through teacher identification and a teacher's proactive informing of parents that selection process happens. And so this work was really focusing on teachers' ratings of students and how those ratings might influence, how those ratings may differ based on these racialized markers and intersections of these markers, and how then that might inform who gets access or who may be recommended for gifted programs. And so what I do in this work is I try to think about race in a much more complex way, and the process of racialization in a much more complex way. So, in a lot of the education work at the time, we'd be lucky if we'd see, right, a white Black difference, or maybe white, Black, and Latinx, as you see the racial groups on the left. But what I do is try to think about this more in terms of racialized subgroups, thinking about the intersection of race, ethnicity, and immigration or generational status. And so these groups are divided as much as could be done within this particular data that I was using, right? So there are limitations of the data and how much one can disaggregate and what those subgroups will look like. But even with those limitations, trying to understand these unique experiences and how they shape pathways. And I have about 3 papers that specifically attend to either these collective groups or different subgroups within these racialized subgroups that, and their experiences in terms of teachers' perceptions. And so you'll see under the racialized subgroups, the left column is focusing on what I call these American subgroups. And this is really third generation and beyond. So they're growing up in families without an immigrant parent or parent who was born abroad. And then the immigrant subgroup, specifically speaking to youth who grew up in a household with at least one immigrant parent, which may then, through its interaction in schools and through the socialization a child receives, provide cues that shapes how a child is racialized by a teacher when they're thought of and when they're thinking about what a student is capable of. And I focus on trying to think about this disaggregation in different ways that capture racialization and phenotype differentiation. And so we have 4 different Latinx subgroups here, focusing specifically on this white, non-white divide and on youth who are growing up in immigrant households versus those that are not. And so what I want to do is just show you some of the findings from this first set of papers to just give you a sense of how and when these things might matter for who is rated in particular ways. So the measures that I was looking at were teachers' ratings of math and literacy. And the specific question is, how would you rate this child in mathematics or language and literacy compared to other children in the same grade? And it goes from far below average to far above average. And what I'm doing here is looking at the likelihood of a child within this racialized subgroup being rated higher or lower relative to white American students, so white students who grew up in third generation beyond households, and trying to get a sense of how these differences might then help us understand differences in who's identified for gifted education. And so what you'll see here is that we have these baseline differences. And what I do is I start here with demographic control. So these are differences in the likelihood of being identified in terms of math ratings after accounting for demographic characteristics like socioeconomic status, family background, household composition. And so you'll see here that it's the white Latinx youth from third generation or beyond households where that difference disappears. But for white Latinx youth from immigrant households, non-white Latinx youth from immigrant households, and non-white Latinx youth from third gen and beyond households still face some inequalities, as do to a greater extent Black American and Black immigrant youth. But when I account for prior math performance, we see that at least for the Latinx youth, the differences disappears. And what this suggests is that the differences that teachers are capturing for these Latinx youth have to do with how they performed before they arrive to the classroom, which means that there is something going on in terms of the youth's opportunities to learn. Because this is not capturing SES or other kinds of background factors that we would think about that would create these inequalities, but is capturing prior math performance, which suggests that these youth are receiving different opportunities to learn prior to being rated by these teachers, and that's influencing their teacher's rating of their math performance. Now, math performance, but another area that matters is literacy ratings. And literacy ratings matters for gifted education, both for math and for reading, because for those of you who know early on, math has a lot of word problems. Your literacy matters for how you do in science and math, so it also matters for those kinds of placements. And when I do the same kind of analysis, I find that even when I count for prior, let's say, reading performance, that there is one group that stands out as still being rated lower than white American students and then other Latinx students, the non-white Latinx American category. So this is speaking to brown and Black Latinx youth who are third generation and beyond, who grow up in the United States, being rated lower, which means that there may be a greater likelihood. And you'll see that their effect size is almost as great as for Black American and Black immigrant youth in terms of how they're rated more poorly by their teachers, which may influence the likelihood that they access these gifted programs that are really important for these pathways, which then may influence they're longer term pathways. And so as youth are here for more generations, non-white Latinx youth face more negative perceptions from their teachers. And what I find is that these negative literacy ratings, in another paper, I looked specifically at just non-white Latinx youth and Black youth and Asian youth disaggregated, and I look at the literacy ratings and find that the majority of these disparities are actually among high achievers, not low achievers. So it is among higher performing students that we find that these students are more poorly rated. So even for non-white Latinx youth who are in the 90th percentile, they are more likely to be rated above average than white youth, but less likely to be rated as far above average, even when they're in the 90th, that means the top 10% of performers. This is not the case for white Latinx youth, only for non-white Latinx youth. And these patterns that you see here mirror the patterns for Black youth. So I want to move to a second moment, right? So we have youth. They are in these gifted programs. They move through school and then they get to middle school. And there's a lot of work looking at the placement of students in advanced math when they get into 7th and 8th grade. We think about this algebra in middle school, or algebra for all kind of movement in middle school that's happening, which is important for thinking about access to calculus and the STEM pathways. And there's a good amount of work already looking at who gets into these classes. And in fact, the gifted identification is a very strong predictor of who gets into these classes. But with this work, I was interested in, let me see, I didn't realize I have, make sure I get all the information up there. With this work, I wanted to look at something slightly different. Instead of looking at who gets in initially, I wanted to look at who is disrupted once they are on these pathways. So I used a high school longitudinal study of 2009 to look at 9th grade youth and have over 13,000 students in this sample. And I look at advanced taking in 9th grade. In this study, I also work on racialized subgroups to the extent that I can disaggregate. And I was fortunate that with this data, I was able to actually not just identify non-white Latinx youth, but in fact, I was able to disaggregate between those that identified as Black and other Latinx youth of color. And so you'll see the distributions here, and these are the racialized subgroups that I focus on to look at these pathways. And I specifically focus on 2 different pathways, but this one is the one I'm going to focus on since I talked about this idea of high achievers and access to these advanced courses. I'm going to talk a bit about staying on track. And so getting into Algebra 1 is already very closely tied to race, and there are racial disparities in that access that are strongly connected with whether somebody is in gifted programs before they arrive to middle school. But even staying on that track, there are major disparities. So even among youth who take an advanced math, such as Algebra 1 in 8th grade, nearly 25% of them, nearly a quarter of them, end up moving down or moving backwards or staying in the same place when they get to high school, most often by having to retake Algebra 1 when they get to 9th grade. So this is 1 in 4 youth, and this number is much higher than the number of youth that have to actually fail those courses. And so what I do is I start by just showing a disaggregated who actually stays on track. And so you can see when you look at the subgroups, there are big differences in the likelihood of who is among those youth who are already taking Algebra 1, who is able to stay on track. And so these are actual percentage point differences in groups and their likelihood of staying on track. So for, you'll see here for white Latinx youth, it's about -5% below the median. So this is looking at the mean, sorry, this is looking at the mean. And then for non-Black Latinx youth, so it's non-white and non-Black, right? Or we can think of maybe brown Latinx youth, it's about 11 percentage points lower than the mean, right? So this is at, instead of 76%, we're talking about 65%. And then for Black Latinx youth, it's -17%. That takes them down to the 50-something% in the likelihood of persisting on that advanced track, which is the same as other Black youth who are not Latinx. So what I did is I looked at some of these disparities and what would help us understand and the extent to which these are influenced by other factors. These differences you're looking here are odds ratios, and they are for youth compared to other youth in their same school. So this is a white Latinx youth versus white youth in their same school, Black Latinx youth versus white youth in their same school. So you can see what disparities look like for youth that are attending the same schools with each other. And you'll notice already there are, when you're looking within schools, big differences and a particularly marked difference for Black Latinx youth, though also disparities for white Latinx and non-Black Latinx youth. But once I account for demographic factors, the differences for white Latinx and non-Black Latinx youth go away. This suggests that the disparities in staying on track for these youth are primarily socioeconomic factors that are tied to things like we saw earlier with Dr. Alvero, where he was talking about income differentials in who is within these populations. But even when we account for demographic controls, Black Latinx youth are much more less likely to stay on track than white youth. And this is even the case even after accounting for their math performance in 8th grade, so their grade that they received in the course. This is 0.44, so this is a 44% lower odds of staying on track than a white student who is in the same school with the same demographic background and the same grade in their 8th grade math course. And you notice that that pattern mirrors in many ways the patterns that we're seeing for Black non-Latinx youth, though we would not include them in that group normally. So the persistence in transitional high school shapes who ends up staying on this advanced math track and is more likely than to have access to advanced math courses, including and particularly calculus, which is really important when we're thinking about who ends up pursuing STEM degrees and the likelihood that they're going to stay on them. And that's where this final paper takes us. And so this paper with Drs. Riegel, Crum, and King focuses on post-secondary persistence. Now, I will say that in this, make sure I got it all out here, there we go. In this paper, we're not able to disaggregate Latinx youth or the intersection of Latinx and Blackness. And part of that is because STEM and STEM fields are such a hoarded space that the numbers were too small to do the disaggregation, which should tell you something in and of itself in terms of who even has access to these spaces. So in this paper, we focus on the likelihood of persisting in a college major field versus switching in that field and even leaving college altogether. And we look at how that looks for different major fields in order to look at the unique nature of the experience that youth are having in STEM fields. And so we start by just pointing out the choice in college major by race and ethnicity. And so what you'll see here is white, Latinx, and Black youth. You'll notice that for STEM fields, and across, when you look at all fields, there's no significant differences between white and Latinx youth, very small differences between white and Black youth in the likelihood of picking majors within these different fields. And so there isn't any significant difference in the likelihood of picking a major that is within a STEM field among these different youth. So what is happening isn't so much about who is opting into these majors to begin with or choosing these college majors when they arrive to college. But there are some patterns by major fields and race and ethnicity on the likelihood of switching. This is switching to a different field altogether and then getting a degree in that field, or leaving school altogether and just not getting a degree at all. So you'll notice that in particular, there are significant differences between both white and Latinx youth and white and Black youth in both transferring out of STEM and leaving school altogether among STEM majors. So there are significant differences. There are also some differences you'll notice in leaving school among business majors, and for Latinx youth also among social science majors. And so what we do is, before we try to explain that, we talk a little bit about academic preparation. And you'll notice that there are some, these are effect sizes for the different academic preparation kind of courses that they take, their test scores of these students. And what we note in this paper is that this is not a measure of ability, but rather a measure of previous opportunity hoarding. It's why I start with elementary school and middle school and high school, because these differences that we're seeing here are capturing all those other moments coming up to college and the differences in preparation that emerge as a result of differences in access to these courses and those differences in opportunities to learn that would influence the likelihood of having particular GPAs and test scores and having access to courses on your transcripts when you arrive to college. And you'll notice that there are differences for both Black youth compared to white youth and Latinx youth. But you also notice that these differences, while there, are not very different across fields, that there are differences across all these different fields in terms of preparation, because students face these kind of factors across school, not just in STEM. So the last thing we do is we focus on the likelihood of switching a major field and the likelihood of leaving school altogether. So when we do our analysis, we look at first the likelihood of switching a major field versus staying in that field and getting a degree. And what we find is while there are baseline differences, once we account for demographic controls, the differences for Latinx youth among STEM youth close. And so this is where we get at this idea of the demographic factors that shape the likelihood of transferring out. Whereas for Black youth, even when you attend, in fact, when you attend the demographic factors, there's no change because demographic factors have almost no influence on the likelihood of switching major fields for Black youth. And these are percentage point differences. So like this 0.14 for Black youth is a 14 percentage point greater likelihood of transferring compared to a white student with the same background, attending the same type of school with the same level of academic preparation upon arrival. But what we do find is when we look at leaving college, there is a significant pattern for both Black students and Latinx students. So you'll notice that there is already high rates of leaving college relative to white students. And while you'll notice that there are some of those patterns across fields, once we account for student demographics and academic preparation, none of the other fields, not in business, not in humanities, not in social sciences, do we see significant differences in the likelihood of leaving college relative to other students, relative to white students with the same background and the same level of preparation. But we do see that pattern in STEM. So STEM is already, the reason we could not disaggregate is the proportion of students who were STEM majors, who were Black or Latinx, just period, in these broad categories was so small, we couldn't even disaggregate further. And even knowing that, Black students and Latinx students are about 14 to 15 percentage points more likely to leave college and not get a degree at all than white students entering these programs that are at the same types of schools with the same socioeconomic backgrounds and with the same level of academic preparation upon arrival to college. So there is something going on in STEM. So we talk about this idea of STEM as a space of opportunity hoarding, that there are things going on in STEM that are not about students' levels of preparation upon arrival, or and not that there isn't that going on too, as we can see in the previous slide, but that beyond that kind of pre-arrival preparation differences and socioeconomic differences, there are also experiences happening within these STEM fields that are pushing both Black and Latinx students out of these spaces, either through transferring into other fields that are not in STEM, or as you can see here, leaving school altogether at significantly higher rates than white students. So what does this all mean? Some of this is connecting the importance of understanding these kinds of pathways, the way that these experiences are an accumulation, that an intervention at one period of time alone is not enough to capture a lifetime of inequality that creates these pathways, so that by the time we're intervening, we are dealing with trying to reverse a lifetime of inequalities and opportunities to learn and in discriminatory experiences and inequalities in access. So that's one issue. But another issue is the issue of data, right? So when the data is available, understanding and being able to disaggregate it allows us to flesh out subgroup experiences that are all often masked with these larger pan-ethnic groups. So for example, looking at the elementary school students and being able to identify the unique experience of these non-white Latinx youth who are not in first or second gen, right? Or not first or second generation, right? In a lot of this literature of education for Latinx youth, focuses on things like language and on immigration, but many of these youth are not in immigrant households and are the ones that are actually being seen or perceived as most negative, and thus having the least access to the kinds of opportunities that teachers could provide as a result of those perceptions. In middle school, you can see that intersection of Blackness for Latinx youth creates a pattern of experiences very similar to Black youth, but those youth are often grouped with Latinx students, not Black students. So when we do interventions, those students would be left out. And so there are different barriers for these different Latinx youth, some socioeconomic, but some also racial, that we need to attend to even among Latinx youth, and how all of these accumulate to the experiences when they get to college. And we can, if we had the data, possibly see very similar patterns happen at the college level. But this also shows our limitations in data because of, as somebody mentioned earlier, the lack of representation within these spaces. When numbers are so small, it's almost entirely impossible to disaggregate, to even see who's there, even though we can, for example, see at the college level whether when there is representation, what is the background of students who are in these kinds of degree programs. The kinds of differences and patterns that we can attend to earlier is much more difficult when we're looking at STEM programs, because, especially when you're looking nationally, because of the underrepresentation of students. Now, this doesn't limit the possibility of analyzing these kinds of factors, let's say within your institution, especially if the numbers are larger, but when we think about the larger kind of national scale and limitations of who has access to STEM and this kind of data, it becomes much more difficult, since most of the time that institutional data is not public. So with that, I just want to acknowledge my funders and supporters and end there and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irizarry. This is amazing work. It is transformational because it again makes the invisible visible and allows us to think creatively about solutions to these barriers. Right now, just as we did with Dr. Alvero, we're going to have small group and think about how these insights translate into your HSI or other institutional context. What does this mean for your programming? What does this mean for the ways in which you make the invisible visible, and the ways in which resources may need to be reallocated? The ways in which the intersection, so Dr. Alvero talked about the importance of disaggregated data by national origin and coupled with income to understand a configuration of inequality that's happening and who accesses the most competitive, institutions and HSIs in California. And Dr. Irizarry talks about, well, what is happening in STEM and how can we look back, not at just what is happening in our own institutions, but what has happened across the life course in terms of the experiences of Latinos in terms of racialization, which is different than national origin. So are Black Cubans or Black Dominicans, Mexicans, et cetera, experiencing something in middle school that might look different than their cousins who may look white, in terms of who's being considered, adequate for STEM or encouraged in that way, or who's experiencing macroaggressions in the classrooms that are tied to their racial status, which is not the same as national origin. And we haven't even touched, first generation college status, but all of those things, and gender.